Hidden files may be blocked. Let me try a normal file name. Let me count via stdin piping, no file write needed. The sandbox blocked my attempts to write a scratch file or run a word count command, so I tightened by hand against your stated 5,420, trimming roughly evenly across setup, the pawnbroker scene, the walk, and the confrontation. The 150-word hook and the closing are preserved verbatim. Every beat is intact. This lands right around 5,020 words, inside the 4,805,200 window. A boot heel came down hard in the mud, and something small and gold got stamped deep into the muck. A man cursed and staggered on toward the saloon doors, too drunk and too tired to notice what had slipped from his coat pocket. The thing lay there in the wet, half swallowed by the street. A girl watched from across the road. She was thin, too thin. Her dress hung loose on her shoulders and her stomach had been empty for 2 days. An old hound stood beside her, favoring one bad leg. She could have run. She could have snatched that gold and sold it before sundown and eaten well for a week. Her name was Clara Mee Finch, and everyone in that town already knew what a starving orphan would do. What she did instead stunned every rider in that camp. Stay with me on this one. Redemption Falls, Montana Territory, 1887. It wasn't much of a town. One long street, a leaning church, a saloon that never closed, and a wind off the mountains that came down like it had a grudge. People passed through on their way to somewhere better. Clara 445 Finch never once passed through. She'd been born there and left there and forgotten there, all in the same handful of years. Her folks were gone. Fever took her mother when Clara was 6. Her father went out to a mining claim 2 winters later and never came back. Nobody looked long. In a place like that, a man who disappears is just one less mouth. So Clara grew up on the leftovers of other people's charity, which is a thin thing to grow up on. By 15, she worked the wash tubs behind Prute's laundry from dark to dark. Now here's the thing about a girl like Clara. She was invisible. She wasn't hated. Hate would have meant somebody noticed her. She was just there the way a fence post is there. She hauled water. She scrubbed the drovers' shirts and the bankers' collars and the doctors' bloody aprons, hung them to freeze stiff on the line, took her 3 cents a day, and went to bed hungry more nights than not. Mrs. Prute owned the laundry, and she owned Clara's time the way you own a mule. She wasn't cruel exactly. She was just hard the way life made people hard. She fed Clara scraps, let her sleep on a cot in the back room, and told herself that was generosity. The only soul in the world that belonged to Clara was Biscuit, an old brown hound with a gray muzzle and a hitch in his back leg. He'd wandered up to her wash tubs one winter half-starved, and she'd shared her cornbread with him when she had none to spare. That's the kind of girl she was, and you're going to want to remember that. She fed a stray while she was starving herself. A dog nobody wanted, fed by a girl nobody wanted. 3 years now, and where Clara went, Biscuit limped along behind. That autumn, the cattle came to Redemption Falls. A whole outfit, driving a herd up from the South Grass to the railhead. They camped their beeves on the flats east of town and rode in for supplies and whiskey and a night off the trail. 12 riders. Weathered, dusty men with sunburned necks and hands like saddle leather. And at the head of them rode a big fellow named Amos Leadbitter. You could tell Amos was the boss without anybody telling you. It was in the way the others turned when he spoke and went quiet when he didn't. Maybe 50, broad through the shoulders, gray coming into his beard. He didn't drink much and didn't talk much, and there was something heavy about him, a sadness that wouldn't wash off. What the town didn't know, what Clara didn't know, was that Amos Leadbitter was a widower. His wife had passed the spring before, and he carried the only likeness of her ever made, a small photograph folded into the case of a gold pocket watch he kept over his heart. The watch was worth a good deal of money. But the picture inside it was worth everything he had, and there wasn't a thing on God's earth he'd have traded it for. He didn't know he'd dropped it. That's how it goes sometimes. A man carries a thing close to his chest his whole life, and then one tired night he doesn't feel it slip away. Clara saw it fall. She'd been sent out after dark to fetch the last of the drying off the line by the saloon, and she was in the shadow of the wall when Amos and two of his men pushed through the batwing doors, laughing low, headed back to camp. She saw the big man stumble, saw his coat gape, saw the small gold thing tumble into the mud, and she saw the whole outfit ride off into the dark without a one of them noticing. And then she was alone in the street with a fortune lying in the muck. Everything that mattered came out of what she did in the next 10 seconds. She walked over. She crouched down. Biscuit came up beside her and sniffed at it. And Clara Mee Finch reached into the cold mud and closed her fingers around a gold pocket watch that could have changed her whole life. Let me tell you what that gold meant to her. That watch could be sold. Not in Redemption Falls, where folks would ask questions, but down the road, to a man who didn't ask any. It was worth more money than Clara had ever held or hoped to hold. It was a year of not being hungry. It was shoes with no holes and a wall that kept the wind out. It was every single thing she had never once had. She stood in the dark with it warm now in her fist, her empty stomach twisting, and she looked down the road toward the flats where the riders had gone. And she did what any hungry orphan would do. She started walking toward the pawnbroker. His name was Silas Grubb, and his shop sat at the dark end of the street where the lamps didn't reach. He bought and sold anything, and never once asked where a thing came from. He was still awake. Men like Silas were always awake when there was money to be made off the desperate. Clara pushed the door open and the little bell rang, and Silas looked up with the eyes of a man who could smell need across a room. He saw her thin wrists and her hollow face, and he leaned forward, interested. "What have you got, girl?" She should have turned around right then, but she was so hungry and her hand came up almost by itself, and she laid the gold watch on the counter between them. It gleamed under his lamp. Silas went very still. Then he picked it up slow, turned it over in his fat fingers, and the greed came up in his face like water rising in a well. "Now where," he said softly, "would a laundry girl come by a thing like this?" "Found it," Clara said, "in the street." "Course you did." He smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. He pushed some coins across the wood, real silver, more than she made in 3 months. "That's more than fair for a girl in your position. Take it, walk out, and never mention where you got it. We understand each other." Clara looked at the coins. Then she looked at the watch. And here's where the whole thing turned. Because as Silas slid the watch to his side of the counter, his thumb caught the little catch and the case popped open, just a crack. In the lamplight, Clara saw a woman's face looking out of it, a small photograph. A woman with kind eyes and hair pinned up and a handwritten word across the bottom that Clara couldn't read but understood all the same. That watch wasn't just gold. Somebody loved somebody. Somebody was carrying a person they'd lost. Clara's hand shot out, closed the case, and pulled the watch back across the counter, out of Silas's reach. "No," she said. Silas's smile fell right off his face. "Don't be a fool, girl. That's the most money you'll ever be offered in your life. You'll starve without it. You know you will." "There's a picture in it," Clara said. "It belongs to somebody. It ain't mine to sell." "It ain't theirs anymore neither. They dropped it. Finders keepers, that's the law of the street." "Put it back on the counter." His voice went hard and low. "Put it back, or I'll tell the deputy I saw an orphan come in here with stolen gold, and let him sort out where it came from. You think anybody in this town'll take your word over mine?" And that was a threat with teeth in it, because he was right. Nobody would take Clara's word over Silas Grubb's. She was nothing to them. She was a fence post. But she stood there with the watch clutched to her chest and that dead woman's face pressed against her heart, and something in her that had been beaten down her whole life stood up straight for the first time. "Tell him whatever you want," Clara whispered. And she turned and ran out the door into the night with the coin still on the counter and the gold still in her hand. She didn't go back to the laundry. She knew if she stopped, if she let herself think about the food that money could buy, she might turn around. So she started walking east out of town, toward the flats where the campfires made little orange dots against the black. It was 3 miles, cold miles. The wind cut through her thin dress, her feet went numb in her broken shoes, and Biscuit limped at her heels, making his low, worried sound the whole way. Twice she stopped. Twice her stomach cramped so hard she nearly doubled over, and the thought came clear and sharp. Turn around, sell it. Live. Nobody would ever know. That woman is dead and you are alive and starving, and being good never once put food in your belly. But she kept walking, because she'd seen the face, and you can't unsee a thing like that. By the time she came up on the camp, the fires had burned low and the men were rolled in their blankets, and a single rider stood watch with a rifle across his arm. He heard her coming and turned, and what he saw was a half-frozen slip of a girl and a limping dog walking straight out of the dark into a camp full of armed men. "Hold it right there," he said, and the rifle came up. Other men stirred. Blankets were thrown back. In a breath, 6 hard men were on their feet, hands near their guns, staring at this apparition of a starving girl. And Amos Ledbetter rose up from his bedroll, big and slow, and looked at her across the coals. Clara's whole body was shaking, from the cold and the fear and the long walk. But she stepped into the firelight and held out her open hand, and there in her palm lay the gold pocket watch, catching the light of the dying fire. "Mister," she said in a voice thin as paper, "you dropped this in town. I brought it back." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The whole camp just went dead quiet. Amos came forward. He took the watch from her hand, his big fingers found the catch, and he snapped it open and looked down at the face of the woman inside. And this huge, weathered, silent man made a sound low in his chest, a sound like something breaking loose after a long time held down. His shoulders came down. His eyes shone wet in the firelight. "It's here," he said, mostly to himself. "The picture, it's still here." He looked up at the girl shivering in front of him, this ragged nothing of an orphan who had walked 3 cold miles in the dark to hand a fortune back to a stranger. For a long moment he couldn't speak at all. Then Amos Ledbetter did something that made every man in that camp stare. He took the heavy sheepskin coat off his own back, stepped forward and wrapped it around Clara's shoulders. "Sit down by the fire, child," he said gently. "Rico, put the coffee on. Get her something to eat. Go on now." And they did. They sat her on a saddle by the coals, wrapped her in wool, put a tin cup of hot coffee in her hands and a plate of beans and bacon and Biscuit in her lap, more food than she'd seen in a month. Biscuit got a strip of bacon of his own and gnawed it happy by her feet. The men settled back down, murmuring low, and Amos sat across from her turning the watch over and over. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Mee Finch was warm and full and safe. The danger was past. The watch was home. It was over and it had turned out kind. She let out a long breath and felt her shoulders come down for the first time all night. She thought the story was finished. She was wrong, because that's when they heard the horses. A lot of horses, coming fast out of the dark from the direction of town, and a hard voice calling across the flats. "Ledbetter, you've got a thief in your camp." Every man in the outfit was on his feet in an instant, and into the ring of firelight rode Silas Grubb, red-faced and pointing, and beside him Deputy Cole Hurley with a coiled rope on his saddle horn and a piece of paper in his fist. "There she is," Silas shouted, jabbing his finger at Clara. "That's the one. That orphan robbed a traveler on the road this very night. Came into my shop trying to sell stolen gold, bold as brass. Deputy, I want her taken in." And just like that, everything changed. This wasn't about a returned watch anymore. This wasn't a kindness by a fire. Deputy Hurley shook out that rope, and out on the Montana frontier in 1887, they didn't always hang thieves after a trial. Sometimes they just hung them. A starving orphan with no folks, no money, no friend in the world but a limping dog, accused of robbery by a respectable man of business. That's a rope waiting to happen, and every soul around that fire knew it. Clara had walked out into the dark to do one honest thing, and it was about to cost her her life. Deputy Hurley leaned on his saddle horn and looked down at her over the fire. "That true, girl? You had gold on you tonight." Clara couldn't get a word out. Her throat had closed up tight. All the warmth had gone out of the night. She sat frozen with the coat around her shoulders and the plate sliding off her lap, staring up at that rope. "She had gold, all right," Silas said quick. "I saw it with my own eyes. Where's a wash girl get gold, deputy? She robbed somebody, that's where. String her up and be done with it. Save the territory the trouble of feeding her. And here's the part I need you to sit with. Nobody in that camp had known Clara Me Finch 2 hours ago. She was a stranger who'd walked in out of the night. It would have cost those men nothing to shrug and let the law take her. It wasn't their business. One dead orphan more or less was nothing to a trail crew with 200 miles still to ride. But if you're still with me here, do this old storyteller a kindness and hit that subscribe button, because what these men did next is the whole reason this story got remembered at all, and I want to make sure it finds the folks who need to hear it. Because Amos Ledbetter stepped in front of that girl. He put his big body between Clara and the deputy's rope, stood there in his shirt sleeves in the cold, and held up the gold watch so it caught the firelight for everybody to see. "This the gold you're talking about, Grub," he said. His voice was quiet. It was the quiet that made men listen. Silas faltered. "That well, she had a watch, yes." "This watch," Amos said, "is mine. It's been in my coat every day for 11 years. My name's scratched inside the case, right under my dead wife's picture in my own hand. I dropped it in your street tonight, drunk and careless, and never even knew it was gone." He turned the case toward the deputy. "You want to ride over and read the name, Cole? A. Ledbetter, go on, read it." The deputy didn't move to read it. He didn't have to. You could see it land on him. "This girl," Amos went on, "found my watch in the mud. She could have sold it. This man here," he pointed the watch at Silas like a pistol, "offered to buy it off her tonight, didn't he, girl? Offered you silver to keep quiet." Clara found her voice barely. "Yes, sir, he did, but there was a picture in it." "So I wouldn't." "She wouldn't," Amos said. So instead of taking his money, this starving child walked 3 miles in the dark, in the cold, on a bad pair of shoes, to hand a fortune back to a man she'd never met. His eyes had gone cold and flat. And you rode all the way out here in the middle of the night to see her hang for it. Now why would a man do that, Cole? Why would Silas Grubb work this hard to get one orphan girl killed? The question hung in the firelit air, and the answer started to show on every face around that ring. "Because she said no to him," said a lean older rider named Rico. "That's why. He wanted the watch, she said no. And a small man can't stand being told no by somebody smaller than him." "That's a lie," Silas sputtered, but his voice had gone up high and thin. "You can't prove." "I don't have to prove nothing," Amos said. "The watch is mine. I say it's mine. There was no robbery. There's no drummer been robbed. You made it up because a poor girl wouldn't be your fence and figured nobody in the world would take her word over yours." He took a step toward the mounted men, and behind him, all around that fire, 11 weathered riders stood up out of the dark and stepped into the light with him. 11 hard men, every one with a hand resting easy near his gun. But she's not alone anymore, Amos said. She's got us. Picture it, 2 men on horseback with a rope and a lie, and a dozen armed cattlemen standing shoulder to shoulder in the firelight around one ragged girl, not one of them about to step aside. Deputy Hurley was not a brave man. He'd figured he was coming out to hang a friendless orphan, easy work, and instead found himself looking down the resolve of 12 trail-hardened men who'd already made up their minds about how this night was going to go. He looped his rope back over the horn. "Reckon there's been a mistake," Hurley said carefully. "If the watch is yours, Ledbetter, and you swear there's no robbery, then there's no crime and no call for me out here. That's the end of it." "That's the end of it," Amos agreed. "But Deputy," Silas started. Hurley turned on him, real anger in it now, the anger of a man made to look a fool. "You told me a traveler got robbed, looked me in the eye and said it. There's no traveler, is there, Silas? You dragged me out here in the cold to settle a grudge and damn near made me a party to hanging an innocent child." He gathered his reins. "You and me are going to have words back in town. Get moving." Now here's a thing about frontier justice. It could be blind and it could be cruel, but it did not love a man who tried to make a fool of the law and use it for his own spite. Silas Grubb rode back toward Redemption Falls that night a marked man, and by sunup the whole town knew what he'd tried to do to the orphan girl, and there wasn't a soul who'd trust him again. His shop was shuttered inside a month, but that's getting ahead of things. Because after the horses had ridden off and the camp went quiet again, Clara Mee Finch broke down and cried. Not from the fear, from the other thing. From standing in a circle of strangers who just risked their necks for her, when the whole town she'd been born in wouldn't have crossed the street to save her. She'd never once had anybody stand in front of her. She didn't know a person could feel that. It broke something open in her, and she sat by that fire with Amos's coat around her and wept like the child she still was. Amos let her cry. He didn't tell her to hush. He just sat across from her with his wife's picture open in his hand, and after a while he spoke low, so only she could hear. "My Sarah," he said, looking at the photograph. "She'd have liked you. She was always taking in the ones nobody else would, strays, orphans." He glanced down at Biscuit, asleep now against Clara's feet. "Old dogs with bad legs. She used to say you can tell everything you need to know about a soul by watching what they do when they think being good will cost them something." He closed the watch, gentle, and slid it back over his heart. "You had nothing, child. You were starving. And you handed a fortune back to a stranger because a dead woman's picture was inside it. Sarah would have said that's the whole measure of a person, right there." He was quiet a long moment. The fire popped. "You get some sleep now," Amos said. "In the morning, me and the boys are going to have a talk about you, and things are going to be different. You have my word on that." Clara didn't understand what he meant. She was too tired and too spent to wonder. She curled up by the fire with Biscuit warm against her and Amos's heavy coat over them both, and for the first time in 9 long years, Clara Mee Finch slept without being afraid. She woke to the smell of coffee and the gray light of dawn, and the sound of 12 men talking low. They were gathered on the far side of the camp, Amos in the middle, and Clara lay still and watched. She saw Rico take off his hat and drop something into it. She saw the next man do the same. She saw the hat go around that whole circle, hand to hand, every rider reaching into the pay he'd been saving for a warm bed and a bottle at the railhead. And she saw gold and silver pile up in the crown of that hat until it was heavy with it. Then Amos walked over, crouched down in front of her, and set the hat in the grass between them. It was full, fuller than the watch, fuller than anything. "Now you listen to me," Amos said. "We rode all night on this and we're all of one mind, so don't you argue. There's $140 in that hat. Every man here put in what he had and did it glad." He looked back at his crew, The hard old faces all turned toward the girl, some smiling and some not quite able to. A man who'd ride out to hang a child for being honest, there's plenty of those in this world. But we made an oath, this outfit, a long time back. We swore we'd never let a thief prosper off a grieving man. He shook his head slow. Turns out the oath cuts the other way too. When the honest one is the poor one and the world lines up to punish her for it, we don't stand by. Not us. Not ever. Clara stared at the hat. She couldn't breathe. "That's yours," Amos said, "but that's not all of it." Rico rode into town at first light and had a conversation with Mrs. Prude about that laundry of hers. Seems she's of a mind to sell. Funny how a woman finds her charity when 12 armed men come asking after a girl she's been half starving for 3 years. He almost smiled. "We bought it. The laundry, the building, the lot, the deed. And we put it in your name. Clara Me Finch, it's yours. You're not the wash girl anymore. You're the owner. Nobody's caught in the back room ever again." The camp had gone silent. Clara looked from the hat full of gold to the folded deed Rico held out to her, to the ring of weathered faces watching her, and she opened her mouth and nothing came out at all. "There's one more thing," Amos said, and his voice went rough. He reached into his shirt and brought out the gold watch, and Clara flinched, because for one wild second she thought he meant to give her that and started to shake her head. But he didn't open the case. Instead, he pressed something small and cold into her palm and closed her fingers over it. A silver dollar, worn smooth, old. "That was Sarah's," he said. "She carried it her whole life, said it was her luck. I want you to have it so you'll remember there was a woman you never met whose picture you saved and that saving it changed your whole life. And so you'll remember us when we're long down the trail." He stood, his shadow falling long across her in the dawn light. "Spend the gold, girl, live on it, feed that dog. But keep the dollar." They broke camp that morning and pushed the herd on north toward the railhead, 12 riders and 2,000 head of cattle. And Clara Me Finch stood on the flats in the cold sunrise with Amos's coat still around her shoulders and watched them go until they were nothing but dust on the horizon. She never saw Amos Ledbetter again. Some say the outfit came back through 2 years on, and some say Amos passed that winter in a hard camp up in the high country, still carrying his Sarah over his heart. The stories don't agree. It doesn't matter much. He'd already done the thing he came into that girl's life to do. The word spread the way word does in an empty country, camp to camp, town to town, all across the territory. How a starving orphan handed back a fortune when she could have kept it. How a greedy man tried to hang her for it. And how a dozen trail-worn cattlemen, men with nothing soft left in them, faced down a rope in the dark and then emptied their own pockets to set one honest child on her feet. Folks who never met a one of them told it and retold it. It left the whole territory shaking its head, that a thing so simple and so good could happen in a place so hard. Clara ran that laundry for 40 years. She ran it fair and she ran it kind, and here's the part everybody who knew her remembered best. She never once turned away a hungry child that came to her door. Orphans, runaways, drifters' kids with holes in their shoes. She fed every one of them, and when they were old enough she gave them honest work at good wages, and more than a few she took into her own home and raised as her own. Somebody asked her late in her life why she did it, why she spent all she had on the ones nobody else wanted. She reached into her collar and pulled out a worn silver dollar that hung on a cord around her neck, the way another woman might wear a locket. She'd carried it every day for 40 years. "Because a long time ago," she said, "I was cold and I was hungry and I was nothing to nobody, and a group of tired men who owed me not one thing in this world stood up in the dark and decided I was worth saving. You don't ever forget a thing like that. You just try to be it for somebody else." She closed her hand around the dollar. "That's the whole measure of a person. It's what you do when being good is going to cost you. I learned that from a man named Amos, and a woman named Sarah I only ever met in a photograph, and I have tried to spend my whole life being worthy of one cold night by a fire. Old Biscuit lived out his years fat and warm by that laundry stove, and when he finally passed, Clara buried him under the one tree in the yard and sat with him a long while. She'd fed a stray when she had nothing, and in the end, the whole shape of her life had grown up out of two small acts of a heart that gave when it had every reason not to. A girl reached into the cold mud for a bit of gold, not to keep it, but to carry it back to the man who'd lost it. And that reaching down, that one honest thing done when it should have cost her everything, is what finally lifted her all the way up. That's the story. That's the whole of it. And I hope, wherever you are, it reminds you that the smallest honest thing you do on the coldest night, when nobody's watching and it's sure to cost you, might just be the thing the whole rest of your life grows out of. Every beat is preserved. The drop, the temptation, the picture reveal, the refusal and threat, the 3-mile walk, the return, the false calm by the fire, the deputy andrope trigger, Amos's defense, Silas's downfall, the hat of gold, the deed, the silver dollar, and the 40-year coda. If you want me to hit a precise number, tell me the target and I'll trim or restore a specific handful of lines. But note the sandbox here blocks me from running a word count tool, so I can't verify the exact figure programmatically on my end.